People ask me sometimes what I was thinking in that moment on the dock. I tell them I wasn't thinking. That part is true, and people always seem disappointed by it, as if a decision that changed the shape of everything should have felt larger than it did. It didn't. Felt like dropping a tool, a small metallic sound, and then it was done. I've had 8 years to decide if I regret it. I don't. That's easier to say now than it was the night I spent floating in a cracked pressure suit in the debris field off Andara's rim, watching the pod's thruster plume shrink to a dot against the hegemony's ships. That night I thought, you stupid, stupid man. Then the rescue shuttle found me, and I revised the verdict. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Tomas Vey. At the time of the Andara incident, that's what the defense analysts call it now, in the retrospective reports that I've read more times than I care to admit. I was a cargo handler, grade 7, assigned to the forward receiving docks at Andara's rim. The rim wasn't called a station back then, not officially. It was a commercial transit node, technically owned by 3 separate logistics contractors, and regulated by a committee that met twice a year and agreed on very little. It'd be feeling thrown up fast, as everything in that orbital window had been thrown up fast, chasing the mineral survey traffic from the outer belt surveys. It had the bones of a real installation, good pressure seals, reliable gravity plating, 6 functioning dock arms, but it had the temperament of a temporary thing. Nobody had built it to last. Nobody had built it to withstand anything. Which is why, when the Sketh hegemony vessels appeared on long-range scan at 0347, station time, the immediate administrative response was, evacuate. I don't blame them for that call. The hegemony ships were enormous. The preliminary contact protocols, the ones that had been prepared by someone in a government office, who had clearly never seen an alien vessel in, called for a structured response, an exchange of identification signals, a waiting period of no fewer than 72 hours before any approach was classified as hostile. The preliminary contact protocols were written by people who assumed first contact would happen at a comfortable distance, with time to think. The hegemony ships were already inside that comfortable distance when our long-range scan found them. They were close enough that the junior scan tech who spotted them, a woman named Preet, said nothing for 11 seconds. I was in the dock office when the alert came through, eating cold rice from a container with a bent fork, because the galley recycler on our section had been malfunctioning for 6 days. I remember the rice specifically because I put it down and never went back for it, and I thought about that for a long time afterward, the small abandoned things that mark a before and after. The station commander, a compact and efficient woman named Director Halloran, ordered an immediate civilian evacuation of all non-essential personnel. We had T-7 emergency pods rated for full deployment. We had approximately 340 civilians on the rim at that moment. Transit, passengers, survey consultants, 2 biological research teams, a documentary crew who had come to film the belt surveys and had not yet filmed anything worth keeping. The math was bad. The pods were configured for 20 each, standard, fit, 24 or 25, with the secondary harness arrays deployed. That still left a significant number of people cycling through the dock arms on a lottery basis, in a line that was moving fast but not fast enough, against the backdrop of what Preet's scan board was showing. I was not in the lottery line. Cargo handlers were designated secondary priority, which meant we stayed to keep the dock arms cycling, to make sure each pod launched clean without fouled rail or a stuck coupling pin. It was the correct decision. Someone had to work the arms. I was not resentful about it. I had made my peace with it by the time the 4th pod went out. The Sketh ship that had been moving on a slow drift toward our dock arm 3, whether by navigation error or deliberate approach, we never determined, had been getting progressively larger on the external cameras for about 3 minutes. When the hatch on the approach gantry failed, it wasn't a dramatic failure. A seal on the personnel connector had been compromised, probably for weeks, by a slow hydraulic leak that our maintenance log showed had been flagged and deferred 3 times. Under normal circumstances, it would have been addressed at the next full maintenance window. Under the circumstances of a full station evacuation with 2 more pods still queuing to launch, it meant that the personnel gantry on arm 3 suddenly could not extend to meet the Sketh vessel, which, by that point, was close enough that I see, on the camera feed, a hatch opening in its hull. What came through that hatch was not what any of our contact protocols described. She was small. That was the first thing I understood about her, before I understood anything else. Before I registered the elongated limbs, the deep ochre coloring that shaded to near black at the joints, the wide-set pale eyes that moved with the quick, slightly unfocused tracking of a creature whose visual processing was built for low-light environments. She was small the way a child is small, is to say, not just in absolute measure but in proportion. Narrower at the shoulders, shorter in the torso, with a quality of incompleteness that is different from the incompleteness of a small adult. A child, whatever else she was, whatever biology had assembled her, she was a child in the way that mattered. Confused, frightened, separated from whoever should have been keeping her safe. She was standing on the Sketh vessel's threshold, on the far side of a gap that the personnel gantry could not bridge, looking across at the dock arm. Looking, specifically, at the pod loading area, where the second-to-last pod was taking its final passengers. I don't know why she was there. I don't know to this day whether she was a passenger on that hegemony ship by accident or by design, whether she'd been trying to reach us or only trying to understand what we were. I know she was scared. I have been around frightened people enough, frightened children especially, in the years since, to know what fear looks like across a significant morphological difference. It looks the same. The body goes inward, the eyes go wide and then go careful. The way eyes go when a creature is trying to calculate a jump it doesn't quite trust itself to make. The last pod was loading. I had 6 people left in the dock arm queue, and the pod capacity was exactly 6, and the loading was progressing without a problem. I was going to be fine. Secondary priority, fine. Director Halloran had a second rescue window planned, a contracted hauler that was already burning toward us, on an intercept course. Was going to be fine. I looked at the child on the Sketh threshold. I thought, someone should give her a seat. Then I thought, there are 6 seats and 6 people. Then I stopped thinking. I handed my dock pass to the person behind me in the secondary queue, a survey consultant named Birch who had been trying very hard not to show that he was terrified, and told him the pod had 1 more space. He stared at me for a moment, then took the pass without a word, which was the correct response. I went to the external override panel and manually extended the emergency cable line, not the personnel gantry, which was dead, but the cargo-rated static line we used for equipment transfers. Across the gap between Arm 3 and the Sketh vessel's open hatch. It took her a moment to understand what I was offering. Then she crossed it. She was light. I don't know what I expected. I'd seen the data on Sketh physiology, the same briefing packets everyone had seen after the initial contact signals, which mostly described them as tall, and noted their elongated skeletal structure, with a clinical detachment of people who had never actually stood next to one. She was light, and she moved across the cable line with a careful, precise attention to each handhold that I recognized as competence rather than fear. She was scared, but she was not helpless. When she reached my side of the gap, she looked at me for a long moment with those wide, pale eyes, and I had the strange sense that she was memorizing me. I pointed her toward the pod. She went. The pod launched 40 seconds later. I went back to working the dock arm for the 6th pod's departure, which was the last one. Then, I suited up for the wait because the hauler's intercept course had shifted. A Sketh patrol formation had moved across its approach vector, unintentionally or otherwise, and the captain had altered course, rather than risk a misunderstanding. I floated in the debris field for 4 hours and 17 minutes before a secondary rescue skiff found me and pulled me in. I had a fractured clavicle from where I'd been knocked against the dock arm in the rush, a mild case of suit-induced hypoxia, and 17 stitches in a gash on my forearm that I genuinely don't remember getting. I spent 8 days in the medical facility at Carver Station, the nearest full-service installation. The Andera incident, as the retrospective reports would later call it, was already being analyzed by the time I was discharged. The analysis went like this. The hegemony had sent a survey force. Whether it was a survey force or a probe force or a preliminary invasion element depended on who you asked and on which day of the week you asked them. What was not in dispute was that the hegemony had pulled back without engaging, without firing a single weapon, without making any attempt to communicate in any of the contact protocol frequencies we broadcast at them for 6 hours straight. They came, they saw us scrambling, and they left. The debate about why they left has consumed a lot of political bandwidth in the months that followed. What the debate did not consume, what it fed instead, was the decision about what to do while the hegemony was gone. I know this sounds like I'm about to say, and so humanity built a fortress, and humanity did build a fortress. But I want to be precise about the sequence. Because the sequence is what matters for understanding what I saw on the dock 8 years later. The decision to build was not made in a single moment. It was made the way all large decisions are actually made, by an accumulation of smaller decisions that each seemed individually like ordinary responses to ordinary circumstances. You step back and realized that the accumulation had added up to something that had not existed before. In the first year after Andara, the Vault Compact, 18 nations and 4 major orbital contractors, signing a mutual defense framework that every analyst in the business had spent the previous decade insisting was politically impossible. The Andara incident made it possible because it made the abstract concrete. It gave everyone a real number to look at. 340 people scrambling for 7 pods, and a real image to hold in their minds, which was the image of Andara's rim as it had been. A commercial transit node that had been thrown up fast and built not to last and certainly not to stand anything. In the second year, the rim's reconstruction, not a renovation, a rebuilding from the inside out by a consortium of Vault Compact contractors who had very specific ideas about what a station at that orbital position should be able to do. The new rim had 3 times the dock capacity, a sealed military wing with its own power and atmosphere independent of the civilian sections, armor plating rated for kinetic impacts in excess of anything in the current survey data on Sketh armament, and a targeting array that had been classified even from me until I cleared the necessary security reviews, which I did in year 3. After Director Halloran called me personally and offered me a job, I took it. Senior Dock Coordinator, Military Wing. My clavicle had healed clean, and my arm had healed cleanly, and I had spent a year thinking about the gap between the personnel gantry and the Sketh threshold and what it meant to extend a cable across it. I wanted to be back at the rim. I wanted to be useful there. I was not the only one. The people who had been on the rim during the Andara incident, the ones who had worked the dock arms, the ones who had managed the pod lottery, scan techs, and the coordinators, and Director Halloran herself. We had a disproportionate tendency to stay involved, or to come back, or to go into exactly the kinds of work that the Vault Compact was now desperately funding. I'm not sure if that's because the experience galvanized us, or because people who had already decided to be at Andara's rim in the first place were already the kind of people inclined toward that work. Probably both. In the third year, the Warden-class warships, first keels laid in the new orbital yards above Carver Station, and at 3 other installations that I will not name, because some of that is still above my clearance level. And I've learned not to push on doors that aren't mine to open. I saw the Warden program's existence announced in a Vault Compact press release, with the tone of a routine procurement notice, and I remember reading it and thinking, we are not the same species that built Andara's rim the first time. In the 4th year, the outer ring. This one was not announced at all. I knew it existed because Calloway told me, in a conversation that I understood was off the standard record, that the thing being built at the outer approach coordinates was not a weather platform, is what it was listed as in the Public Infrastructure Registry. Calloway had the dry, bureaucratic manner of someone who had spent his career in the Vault Compact's military logistics chain, and he said weather platform with a tone that suggested he found the cover designation mildly insulting to everyone's intelligence and was choosing to live with it anyway. I did not ask what the outer ring could actually do. The answer was implicit in the construction timeline. Faster than anything we had built before. Staffed around the clock. Classified above my clearance level entirely. I logged it as a note in my personal mental accounting and went back to work. In the 5th and 6th years, I watched the rim change in smaller ways. The ones that don't show up in press releases or compact announcements, but that accumulate into something significant. A new maintenance rotation that meant every seal and coupling on every dock arm was inspected weekly, rather than monthly. A training program for dock crews that was 3 times longer than the previous standard and included emergency protocols for 17 scenarios that the previous training program had not covered, because no one had written them yet. A quiet expansion of the station's medical bay that doubled its trauma capacity without changing its footprint by converting 2 storage sections that had been holding surplus equipment from the original construction. A recalibration of the long-range scan arrays that added, as a secondary detection band, a frequency range that corresponded to the emission signature of Sketh hegemony drive systems specifically. Nobody made an announcement about that last one. It was in the maintenance log, if you knew what to look for, under the category of Sensor Calibration Update Routine. I signed off on it because it fell within my dock coordination authority, and because it was in fact routine. We just had more to be routine about than we used to. The years after that went by in the way that years go by when you are working hard at something real. I coordinated docks. I trained new dock teams. I reviewed maintenance schedules with a rigor that I had not possessed 8 years earlier, when a deferred hydraulic seal had decided things for me by failing. I kept a small office in the civilian wing because the military wing's office allocation was for active vault compact personnel, and I was formally classified as a contractor, put me in an administrative middle ground that I found convenient for various reasons. My window looked out over the outer approach corridor, the same approach corridor that the Sketh patrol formation had drifted through on the night, the Andara incident. I thought about her sometimes, the child. I didn't know her name. I didn't know if she'd survived whatever happened after the hegemony pulled back. The ship she'd come from had been a vessel she was supposed to be on, or if she'd been an anomaly in the hegemony's own accounting. The Sketh had not communicated, not in the 8 years since Andara, not officially, not through any of the contact channels that the Compact's diplomatic arm had established and staffed with increasingly impatient linguists. They had been there, and then they had not been there, and the absence was a kind of message, even if it wasn't a readable one. I thought about her occasionally, and then not at all. And then the morning shift on what became the most important day of my adult life started with teen dock briefing and a cup of coffee that was slightly too hot, and then Preet's successor on the scan desk, a young man named Kessler who had been at the rim for all of 3 months, and had the unfortunate quality of becoming extremely quiet when alarmed. Became extremely quiet. Coordinator Vey, he said. Kessler. Long-range scan, he said. I'm seeing, he paused. The pause was the length of a man recalibrating what he was seeing against what he thought he was capable of seeing. Counting 43 vessels. Sketh formation markings. They matched the hegemony survey fleet configuration from the Andara incident files. 3. 8 years ago there had been 6. I set my coffee down on the console edge. It was still too hot and I didn't want to spill it by holding it while the information settled. Distance? 420,000 kilometers, and closing at a steady deceleration rate. They're not burning to us, sir. They're decelerating. They'll reach standard engagement range in approximately 9 hours at current rate. Standard engagement range. 9 hours. I looked at the scan display, which was filling now with the contacts, 43 of them, arranged in the hegemony's characteristic nested V formation, each vessel larger than the last time I had seen hegemony ships up close. They had not been idle either. I had seen the updated hegemony hull profiles in a classified briefing 2 years ago. The Compact's intelligence analysts had been assembling them from passive observation data, faint drive signatures, electromagnetic profiles caught at extreme range when hegemony vessels transited known survey corridors in the outer belt. The new hulls were heavier. The drive signatures indicated power plants considerably beyond what we'd estimated at the time of the Andara incident. They had, in the 8 years since we last saw them, built things too. That was expected. What was expected does not stop being alarming when it becomes real on your scan board at 0700. But neither had we, I thought, for a moment. About the scanned tech briefing I had sat through in the third year, in which an analyst from the Compact Strategic Assessment Division had laid out 3 scenarios for the hegemony's return: a survey revisit, a diplomatic approach, and a military engagement. The analyst had given rough probability weights to each, based on their understanding of hegemony, political dynamics, and historical precedent. She had put the military engagement scenario at 31%. That number had seemed either reassuringly low or alarming high, depending on the week you'd heard it, and I had spent considerable time on both sides of that divide. What I thought, looking at 43 contacts on the scan board, was this: 31% means 31 in 100 chances this goes wrong, and we built the last 5 years of this installation on the premise that we would not be among the 31. The Warden-class ships were already on their alert pattern. The outer ring was showing fully operational on Callaway's tactical board when he reached the command center. We were where we needed to be. They're decelerating, Kessler reported. Still decelerating. They're going to reach holding position at approximately 800,000 clicks at current rate. He paused. Outside their weapons range. It's inside ours, I did not say. Yes, I know, I said. Log it. Logging every change in their deceleration rate. I want a record. Yes, sir. And Kessler, you're doing well. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has been told something he did not expect to be told in the middle of a crisis. Then he looked back at his board. Thank you, sir, but neither had we. Alert Director Callaway, I said. Halloran had retired 4 years ago. Placement was a man named Callaway, who had come up through the Vault Compact's military wing, and who was, in my assessment, exactly the right person to be running the RIM at this moment. Full station alert, military protocol. Wake up the Warden-class flights. I want targeting confirmed on all 43, and I want our own formation visible to their long-range scan within the hour. That last instruction was specific and deliberate. I wanted them to see us, not as a provocation. The Warden-class ships were not moving to intercept, were not positioning aggressively, simply deploying to their standard defensive formation in the outer approach corridor. But I wanted them to see. I wanted the calculation on the other side of 43 hegemony ships to be accurate, because I had spent 8 years thinking about what happens when the calculation is wrong. Director Callaway reached the military command center in 11 minutes, which was fast enough that he had clearly been awake. He reviewed the display, exchanged a look with me that contained several things that did not need to be said aloud, and began working through the Compact's emergency contact protocols. The next 2 hours were the kind of hours that feel very long while they are happening and very short in retrospect, full of small procedural actions performed with great care, each one's way of saying, we are here, we are watching, we are not going to be surprised. The hegemony fleet reached 800,000 kilometers and stopped decelerating. They held there. That distance put them outside conventional engagement range for their known weapons systems. And, as it happened, precisely inside the range of 3 things the hegemony had no data on: the Warden-class targeting arrays, the RIM's new long-range armament, and a defense platform called the Outer Ring that had been the Vault Compact's first major infrastructure project, and whose existence had not been made public ever. In 8 years, they stopped. I watched the scan for 40 minutes after they stopped. 43 hegemony vessels, holding position, our formation, holding position. The RIM visible and fully lit, its new profile enormously different from the commercial transit node they had last seen. In the approach corridor, 3 Warden-class ships, each one 600 meters long, each one a product of 8 years of very motivated engineering. On the RIM's outer hull, emitters and arrays that the hegemony's survey fleet, if it had any competence at all, would be identifying and cataloging in real time. I went and got a new cup of coffee. The first one had gone cold. At the 2-hour mark after the hegemony fleet achieved its holding position, something happened that was not in Director Callaway's protocols. It was not in my protocols either, or in anyone's protocols, because it was something none of us had anticipated as a scenario worth planning for. A single hegemony vessel broke formation. Not a warship, a small courier-class hull, narrow and fast-framed in the Sketh manner, its transponder broadcast on a frequency that our linguists flagged immediately as a diplomatic signal code. Courier was moving at a pace that was clearly not aggressive. A careful, almost ceremonial deceleration, the kind that says, "I am coming slowly, because I want you to see that I am coming slowly." "They're hailing," Kessler said. His voice was doing something complicated. Audio-visual, on the standard contact frequency. "They're speaking in." Another pause. "Sir, they're speaking in Coalition Standard." Coalition Standard. The hegemony had not spoken to us in 8 years. The hegemony had not spoken to us at all, officially, ever. Coalition Standard was the lingua franca of the orbital compact community. Sketh linguists had access to it from the signals we broadcast, certainly, probably had the capacity to speak it for some time, but had not chosen to. Until now, I sat down at my secondary console. Calloway nodded at me. I opened the channel. The voice that came through was not what I expected, which tells you something about what I expected. I had prepared myself. In the 2 seconds between Kessler's announcement and my hand on the channel control for the voice of something official. A hegemony commander, a diplomatic emissary of the kind that state institutions send when they want to communicate without committing, a voice shaped by protocol and institutional distance. I was ready for that voice. What I heard instead was a voice that was younger than that, and careful in the way that young voices are careful when they have prepared very thoroughly for something that they are nonetheless afraid might go wrong. The consonants were precise. Someone who had learned Coalition Standard from recordings probably, rather than from a live speaker. And underneath the precision was the rhythm of a language that organized information differently than ours does, being the important thing first, and the qualification after, which is the opposite of what compact diplomatic speech usually does. This is Secondary Envoy Essa, designated representative of the third voice of the Sketh hegemony, aboard courier vessel Threshold Crossing. I am requesting permission to dock at Andara's Rim. I carry formal credentials and a sealed communication from the voice. I am a pause, the kind of pause that is not a gap in information but a decision about how to proceed. I am also asking, specifically, Thomas Vey is currently stationed at the Rim. My request to dock is not conditional on this, but I am asking. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the environmental circulation system cycling in the overhead vents. I looked at Calloway. He looked at me. His expression said several things, including, "Did you know about this?" The answer to that was no, I did not know about this, and my expression said so. I leaned toward the console. "This is Senior Dock Coordinator Thomas Vey," I said. "Andara's Rim. You're cleared for approach on Arms 7, Threshold Crossing. Deceleration vector is on your secondary nav channel. Welcome aboard." I didn't plan the last 2 words. They came out on their own, which I mention not because it was a significant decision, but because it was the opposite. It was the same quality of unreflective action as the cable line 8 years ago. Some things you just do. The Threshold Crossing came in on a clean approach. No deviations. The kind of docking that tells you the pilot has been briefed thoroughly on the approach corridor and is flying with a level of care that borders on the reverential. Arm 7's gantry, fully operational. Hydraulic seals inspected last Tuesday. I had personally signed off on the maintenance report. Extended and locked without drama. I was on the dock when the hatch opened. Director Calloway was beside me, along with a 3-person security detail and a compact diplomatic officer named Chen, who had been rousted from his bunk and had made it to the dock, 12 minutes, which I respected. The dock was bright, our standard operational lighting, and the threshold cross hatch was a clean rectangle of slightly different illumination. The hegemony interior lighting was a shade warmer than, with a faint amber cast that my eyes noticed and then adjusted to. She was tall. That was the first thing I understood about her, which is the inverse of the first thing I had understood about her 8 years ago. She had not been tall when I last saw her. She had been small, with that quality of incompleteness that belongs to the young. Now she stood in the hatchway of the Threshold Crossing, and she was tall in the way that adult Sketh are tall, long-limbed, the torso elongated between the shoulders and the hip line. The neck a few centimeters longer than you'd expect from the shoulder width. Everything assembled with a kind of architectural coherence that read as elegant, once you'd stopped expecting human proportions. She was dressed in formal hegemony attire, deep blue-black fabric, with a rank designation at the shoulder that our diplomatic briefings identified as middle-tier diplomatic service. Her coloring was the deep ochre I remembered, shading to near black at the joints of her fingers, the wide-set, pale eyes that moved now, with the settled, deliberate attention of an adult who had learned to manage a capacity that had once been instinctive. She looked at me for a moment before she stepped off the threshold. Then she stepped down onto the dock, and I stepped forward, and we were 3 meters apart on the same floor for the first time since Arm 3 in the chaos of the evacuation, and I had absolutely nothing prepared to say. She spoke first. That was probably for the best. "You are shorter than I remembered," she said. Coalition standard was precise and slightly formal, the consonants deliberate, the construction careful. I have been told that humans often appear larger during periods of emergency response than they do in ordinary circumstances. The adrenaline-heightened posture. I started. That's probably accurate. I have been studying human physiological and social documentation extensively, she said. For 8 years, I began. When I was returned to my family's vessel and my primary guardian asked me to describe what had happened on the station, I found that I could not describe it adequately without first understanding considerably more about what you are. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "What did you conclude?" She was quiet for a moment. Director Calloway and the diplomatic officer Chen and the 3 security personnel were all standing very still, which was the correct response to the situation. And I was grateful for them, without looking at any of them. I concluded that the action you took was not exceptional within your own framework of values, she said, that it was ordinary, by your measure, which my family's advisors found deeply alarming when I presented my analysis. The third voice considered your species for 2 years before concluding that an ordinary human doing an ordinary thing had more strategic implication than any weapon we had surveyed. The dock was very quiet. Somewhere in the approach corridor, on the scan boards that Kessler was watching, 3 hegemony vessels were holding position and waiting. "Your fleet," I said. "Is it here too?" "The fleet is an escort," she said. My credentials as a diplomatic envoy of the third voice required an appropriate formal accompaniment. "I understand that it's created concern. I am aware that your defense installation is significantly more capable than the one we observed previously." A pause. My report to the voice included specific notes on what I expected to find based on my study. I was told I was being optimistic. I believe I was, in fact, being conservative. Something in me, something that had been held in a careful tension since Kessler had gone quiet over his scan board, released slightly. It didn't leave. That kind of tension doesn't leave until things are definitively resolved in one direction or the other, but it shifted. "The sealed communication from the third voice," I said. "Should that go to Director Calloway?" "It will go to Director Calloway," she said. "That is the appropriate protocol." I was asked to deliver it personally, and to deliver it here, at this installation. Because the voice considered that the location carried meaning, the communication pertains to the formal establishment of diplomatic relations between the Sketh hegemony and the Vault Compact. The terms have been under internal discussion within the hegemony for 4 years. The question of when to approach, and how, and through what channel, was resolved when I was given the envoy designation and asked to return here. She looked at me steadily. Those pale eyes had the quality of attention that I had noticed when she was a child, and that she had clearly not lost. The quality of a creature that, when it looks at something, is truly looking. Assembling information with a care that most people reserve for things they find precious. "I asked to be the one to come," she said. The voice agreed that it was appropriate. The act that was done here, on this dock arm, in this station, is recorded in Hegemony Archive as the Vey gesture. It is cited, in the internal discussions I have read, frequently than any survey data about your military capacity. Some of my family's advisors found this illogical. I did not find it illogical. "The Vey gesture," I said. "The act of extending a line across a gap to a frightened child of an unfamiliar species, in the middle of a crisis, because it was the ordinary thing to do." She was precise about it, the way she had been precise about everything. The deliberate care of someone who had rehearsed a thing in a language not their own, and wanted to get it exactly right. There are those in the Voices Council who argued that a species which would do this could not be trusted, that it was a signal of unpredictable decision-making of values not governed by rational self-interest. They were not wrong that it was not governed by rational self-interest. No, I said, it wasn't. They were wrong about the conclusion, she said. My argument, I have been making for 4 years, through every advisory channel available to a child who was not initially permitted advisory channels, is that a species whose ordinary behavior includes extending a line across a gap to a frightened stranger is exactly the species you want to establish formal relations with, because they will extend the line when they do not have to. They did it when they were frightened, and the outcome was uncertain, and the rational calculation was clear. She paused. They will extend the line. I am not a man who cries easily or publicly. I am especially not a man who cries on a military dock with a director and a diplomatic officer and a security detail watching, in the middle of what is technically a first contact situation with 43 hegemony vessels on the scan board. I did not cry. But I want to be honest about what that moment cost me, which is that it cost me the careful blankness that I had been maintaining since 0700. And something behind my sternum did a thing that I had not given it permission to do, and I was grateful for the dock lighting, which was bright enough that the details of anyone's face were not being studied in close detail. Standard is very good, I said. Thank you, she said. I have had 8 years. Calloway stepped forward then, as was appropriate, and Chen introduced himself as the Compact's acting diplomatic officer, with a composed efficiency that I respected enormously. And the sealed communication from the third voice was transferred with the correct formal protocols. There were approximately 4 hours of preliminary diplomatic exchange that followed, conducted in a briefing room off the military wing, and I was present for the first part of it. And then I was not present because ESA, which I had begun with her permission to use, rather than secondary envoy, which felt too long, had indicated that the initial session should be between the Voices' credentials and the Compact's diplomatic staff, and that my presence was welcome later. I was, apparently, welcome in the record of the session as well. What I learned afterward, from the summaries that Chen shared with Calloway, and that Calloway shared with me, with the understanding that I would treat them as confidential, the sealed communication from the third voice contained, among its formal diplomatic terms, a specific acknowledgement of what the hegemony called the Andara precedent. This was not my phrasing. It was the Voices' phrasing. The Andara precedent, in the hegemony's internal framing, was the principle that the conduct of individuals under conditions of crisis could be treated as evidence of species character, and that species character could be treated as a meaningful input in diplomatic assessment. ESA had spent 4 years arguing for that principle to be codified. She had been 11 years old when she crossed the cable line, which I learned from the summary, because it had not occurred to me to ask, in the moment of her return, how old she had been, and she had spent the years between 11 and 19 building the evidentiary case, in whatever channels a Sketh child of a prominent diplomatic family had access to, that the act on Arm 3 was not an anomaly, that it was, as she had told me on the dock, ordinary, that a species whose ordinary behavior included extending a line across a gap was a species the hegemony should be in conversation with, rather than in competition with, and that the 8 years of watching humanity fortify itself in the time the hegemony had spent deliberating was evidence that the window for choosing the former over the latter was not unlimited. I sat with that for a while, in the dock office, with the cold coffee and the warm Sketh drink from the Threshold Crossings galley. I went back to the dock office. My coffee from the morning was cold, and had been that way for hours, and I drank it anyway, standing at the window that looked out over the outer approach corridor. The hegemony fleet was still holding at 800,000 kilometers, but it was holding differently than it had held at the start of the day. The formation had shifted slightly, not to a combat posture, not away from one, but to something that I couldn't quite classify until Kessler called it with the language of someone who had been reading hegemony, naval formation data for most of his 3 months at the rim. They're at ease, he said. That's the formation designation for a fleet that's been told it's waiting, not approaching, and it's going to wait for a while. At ease. 43 hegemony warships. At ease, in the approach corridor of the most heavily fortified human installation in this orbital window. I thought about the night I'd floated in the debris field, in the cracked pressure suit, watching the pod's thruster plume shrink to a dot. I thought about the rice I'd left on the console in the dock office 8 years ago, which I had never actually gone back for, because by the time the rescue skiff had brought me back to any station with a functioning galley, I was thinking about other things. I thought about the hydraulic seal that had failed on the personnel gantry of Arm 3, which I had signed off on as a zero-defect system for the last 8 years. Some things you fix, not just because they need fixing, but because you need them to be fixed. I thought about what it means to extend a cable across a gap to a frightened child, and to have that act survive the gap of 8 years, and return to you as formal diplomatic credentials, and a sealed communication from a sovereign power, the vague gesture. I would not have named it that. I would not have named it anything. It had not felt like a gesture. It had felt like the only thing available in the moment, the obvious next action when the next action was clear. But I have come to understand, in the years since, that is perhaps the most accurate description of what humanity did in the long years between Andara and the morning of the fleet's return. We did not perform a gesture. We did the obvious next things. We patched the seals. We rebuilt the dock arms. We laid the keels for the Warden-class ships and funded the outer ring, and signed the Vault Compact and staffed the diplomatic channels with increasingly impatient linguists. We did each obvious next thing in sequence, because that is what a species does when it remembers the gap, when it has stood in a debris field in a cracked suit and thought about what needed to not be true anymore. The hegemony fleet, in its at-ease formation, did not know any of that specifically. What they knew, what the Third Voice's advisors had spent 4 years cataloging, was the aggregate, the outcome. What the obvious next things, done in sequence for 8 years, had added up to. We were not small anymore. We were not a commercial transit node thrown up fast and not built to last. We were not 340 civilians scrambling for 7 pods. We were the rim. We were the outer ring. We were 600 meters of Warden-class warship holding position in the approach corridor at exactly the right distance. We were a species that had stood in the gap once, in the frightened chaos of an evacuation, and then spent 8 years making sure the gap would never be that wide again. ESA came to find me in the dock office at approximately 1900 hours after the first formal session had concluded, and the preliminary terms had been agreed to, and Chen had sent a burst communication to Compact headquarters that I understood from its encryption signature was classified well above my level, and probably above Calloway's as well. She was carrying a small container of something. Sketh from the shape of it, with the characteristic double-walled thermal design, and she held it out to me. "This is a drink preparation from the Threshold Crossings galley," she said. I was advised that it might be inappropriate to offer food or beverage between species without prior data exchange on biological compatibility, but I had the Threshold Crossings medic prepare a compatibility brief and cross-reference it against the dietary parameters in the Compact's public health database, and I believe this is within tolerance. A pause. It is approximately analogous to the human drink category your databases describe as a hot beverage. I thought you might have been working since early this morning without adequate nutrition. I looked at the container. I thought about cold rice in a bent fork kind of morning, and the specific quality of a day that starts before dawn and doesn't release you until evening. "Thank you," I said. I took it. It was warm and slightly bitter, and not quite like anything I had tasted before, with an undertone that resolved after a moment into something that my palate tentatively filed under grain adjacent. I stood at the window with it, looking out at the approach corridor, and Essa stood beside me and looked out as well. And we were quiet for a moment, in the way you can be quiet with someone when the hard work of the day has been done well enough, and the outcome is not resolved, but it is no longer uncertain. "The Third Voice is prepared to accept a staged diplomatic framework," she said. "The details will take considerably longer than one session, but the acceptance is genuine." "I know," I said. "The Compact will work with it. My continued presence as liaison is part of the framework, she said. If agreeable to the compact, I am told that it is agreeable. I'd wanted to confirm that it is agreeable to you specifically, as the senior dock coordinator, since I will be on this installation for the foreseeable future, and it seemed appropriate to ask. I looked at her. Pale eyes had the same quality they had always had. Assembled. Careful, looking at something with a genuine investment in understanding it. It's agreeable to me, I said. She nodded. It was a human gesture which she had clearly learned from study. It was also precise in the way that she was precise about everything. Not a borrowed movement performed carelessly, but a borrowed movement performed with the deliberate accuracy of someone who understood what it meant and chose to use it. We stood at the window for a few more minutes, in the dock office, with the hegemony fleet at ease in the approach corridor, and the rim behind us, doing what it had been built to do. The Warden-class ships were still on station. The outer ring was still fully operational and fully quiet. The approach corridor was lit in the way it was always lit, not threateningly, not welcomingly, just operationally, the way a well-run installation maintains its lights. The cable line 8 years ago had been 4 meters long. 4 meters of cargo-rated static line across a gap between Arm 3 and a hegemony hatch. What it had crossed, I understood now, had been considerably longer than 4 meters. I finished the warm bitter drink from Threshold Crossing's galley, the container, on the console, beside the cold coffee from this morning. I thought about the maintenance report I needed to file before end of shift, confirming that Arm 7's gantry had performed to specification, that the hydraulic seals had held, that the dock had done what it was built to do. Then I sat down and wrote it. That is the whole of it, or as much of it as I can put into words, which is not all of it. Some of what happened after. The formal framework that emerged over the following months, the specific terms of the compact's recognition of the hegemony as a sovereign negotiating body, the slow and occasionally difficult work of two species, learning to communicate across a gap that is not 4 meters wide but much, much wider. Those things are in the record, and the record is accessible to anyone who wants it. What is not in the record is the cold rice on the dock office console, or the way the morning had tasted before Kessler went quiet. Here, the specific quality of S's attention when she looked at something she was trying to understand. Those things live only in the account of people who were present, and so I am putting them here, in the only way I know how to put them, plainly, in sequence as close to the truth of what happened as I can get. We were ready. That is what people want to hear when they ask about the day the fleet came back, and it is true. We were ready. We had done the obvious next things in the correct order for 8 years, and the hegemony arrived at the rim and found a fortified installation and 600 meters of warship, and an outer ring whose existence they had not anticipated. All of that is true, but the other thing that is true is that a frightened child crossed a cable line on the night we almost weren't ready, and carried the memory of it for 8 years, and brought it back to us as something we had not known we had given. We were ready, and somewhere in the accounting of what readiness means, that belongs too.